Hello, I am Phumelela Makatini, the CEO and Principal Officer of the Building and Construction Industry Medical Aid Fund, BICIMA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first episode of Tea with Phumi, a new platform giving space to conversations that we believe are important to our members, clients, and the private healthcare community during what is, without a doubt, an unprecedented time. It is our aim that Tea with Phumi will provide further insights into developments within the greater healthcare and business sectors from a balanced viewpoint. On that note, welcome Dr. Bengu, founder of Alchemy Health, former chairperson of the Road Accident Fund, and a panel member of the Competition Commission's Health Market Inquiry, amongst other things. Indeed, a man of a formidable list of accomplishments to his name. Today, Dr. Bengu is with us in his capacity as a panel member of the Health Market Inquiry, which, as you will recall, was launched to investigate the high prices and uncompetitive nature of the private healthcare industry. It has been noted that the recommendations of the final HMI report, which was published at the end of September 2019, merit extensive discussion and debate, as they could, if implemented, have far-reaching consequences for the future of the healthcare system. Dr. Bengu, how is all this progressing, particularly in light of COVID-19?
No, thank you. The process right now is that the NHI bill is in Parliament. Parliament has been taking comments on it. So the issue is now, what are the next steps towards implementation? On the question of affordability, that is the big question that those who criticize the NHI, or maybe whether we can afford, really sort of handle, or rather go for. It doesn't help that the last time any financial projections were seen were the first time the NHI the idea was floated, and that was around 2012. Now, it's absolutely true that COVID certainly has made everything relatively unaffordable, including healthcare. But the WHO will say no country can afford not to have universal health coverage, in our terms, the NHI. So the issues are up there, but we certainly haven't seen the numbers that tell us on affordability, and that was just before COVID. Yeah, the thing about the NHI is that I don't think anyone can fault the principles at the core of the NHI. And if one looks back, it's really about every citizen having access to quality healthcare at no cost at the time that they are seeking care. And this care should not really be available based on affordability, but it should be based on need. That if you really do need care, the last consideration should be whether you can afford it or not. Because the principle is simply that no one should go bankrupt looking for healthcare. I agree with you that there is scope. The medical scheme industry, with its fault, it's not perfect. That's the whole point about the HMI and the Medical Schemes Amendment Bill that's under consideration now. But the issue is the WHO, a lot of people miss the point that it says each country must start from the model it has in place. And we have a very competitive and competent medical scheme industry, and we should build on it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this industry that is exporting its expertise globally. South African companies are leading some aspects of health funding.
Correct.
And it would be a shame if we cannot use that, at least as backup, certainly in the first instance. My view is that instead of shutting down the industry, you rather build the public sector to be so good that people choose not to use the medical scheme industry simply because, or the private sector, simply because the public sector is so good. I think that's the goal. But sort of saying that, it's important to stress that I am not suggesting that people mustn't necessarily contribute, but the option to still use private sector after contributing, I just don't see where there would be a disadvantage to government. If anything, you have 9 million people who have contributed to the public sector
True.
but choose not to use it.
True.
It can only be a disadvantage. It can only be an advantage.
Let's talk about HMI, Health
Yes.
Market Inquiry.
Yeah.
It's a very topical issue as well.
Well, the funders, unlike the supply side, are fairly well regulated, even though we do say that there still are gaps which were intended to be plugged but haven't been. So there's still some work to be done there. The main point about competition, though, is that quite a few people believe that healthcare is a special good, so it need not be subjected to competition laws. That is actually not a true position in my view. There is an entire discipline on competition in healthcare. And why this is important is because it has been shown that if the industry or a sector of an industry is not competitive, prices will be higher than they need to be, or the quality of service will be poorer than it can be. Now, you can see how this is important, even building up to the national health insurance, because you want all of those who are on the supply side to be regulated to make sure that pricing is fair and the quality of service is justified and or rather good for the patient. People always forget that the National Health Service, which is regarded as the best there is globally, has got a regulator still that deals with these issues from the supply side. So the argument that we've seen here, people are saying, then do you need the HMI if you're going to have the NHI anyway? And the point is simply that it's an important part in preparation for the NHI.
From a Council for Medical Schemes perspective, there's what we call prescribed minimum benefits, which also speak a lot to pricing. So they enforce medical schemes to pay for what they deem to be prescribed minimum benefits. So don't you think that at least they're meeting you halfway? CMS is meeting you halfway in that regard?
Yeah, there is a role for that in healthcare. It's part of making healthcare affordable, but also making sure that the industry doesn't choose not to cover the really expensive but necessary care. What we found, though, was that the weakness in the prescribed minimum benefit part of this whole regulation is the fact that it's designed mainly for hospital care, which misses the whole point of primary care, which is preventative.
Correct.
So that needs to be addressed. It's there in the regulations. So it is an important part, but as it stands, it's got gaps, and it drives healthcare costs in the manner that it's easy between the patient and the practitioner to basically choose an admission over something that could be treated on an outpatient basis, simply because then when in hospital, all costs will be taken care of.
Sure.
So that is potentially a driver of expenditure in healthcare.
There's certainly gaps there. And then lastly, while we're still on the HMI topic, one of your other findings, which we haven't explored, speaks to the close proximities between the administrators and the schemes. The recommendation is such that it shouldn't be the case. So from a scheme's perspective, there's a thin line between what's a close proximity between the scheme and its administrator. What does the HMI recommend as a proper relationship between the two parties?
Yeah, I must say, the solution isn't so easy because you can have the laws, but there's also the issue of the spirit of the law. The point there we were flagging was the potential governance pitfalls. The medical schemes are by design non-profit entities.
Correct.
Medical scheme administrators are for-profit entities. Now, the question is management of a medical scheme as motivated as management of an administrator is? We know what motivates the administrator. Profit certainly plays a part. Now, the question is what motivates the trustee, the principal officer to do what's best for their member? And then it took us to how trustees are elected, how principal officers, their KPIs, are they really about acting in the best interest of the member in holding the administrator accountable at all possible costs? Now, there are issues that also came up that are linked to that. We found that surely it's not a coincidence that the competition between the medical schemes and administrator really is that you find that it's the restricted schemes that administrators compete for. Yeah, the concern is that competition is not happening at the right level. And if you look at schemes that have been moving between administrators, it's really happening only at the restricted scheme level, not so much the open scheme level. What is the reason? And the point that we were making is that, for example, it starts from the shared names at times between administrator and the scheme. You can see how that could confuse consumers and patients, not even knowing that these are two different entities.
Correct.
But also on competition level, there were questions about cross-directorships and cross-ownerships of administrators.
Again, it speaks to a governance issue.
Yes.
And it reminds me of the male and guardians question, who guards the guardians?
Who guards the guardians, yes. But we did see movements, because then when you talk about cross-directorships, then it's easier to make a call on that. And we did see some resignations from boards where one person is on two competing boards. That happened before the inquiry was complete. Because you can actually see it's now far more direct. It's not so much like an owner who doesn't participate in the strategic day-to-day decision. But if I'm a director and I sit on this administrator board meeting, and next week I'm sitting on the other and they're competing, then it's easier to call that out. Again, even though it may not be directly illegal because you'll have to prove that the pricing is determined and delivered by this director for both boards. But that's not. So
That's
it's
where
complicated.
opportunities of price fixing.
The concern is that potentially.
Potentially.
I must stress that we did not find that.
Okay.
But that's where you might want to intervene to prevent something like that. But as I say, we did see movements where 2 or 3 directors, if I'm not mistaken, resigned one of the other boards where they felt that the competition issue is there.
This was still when you were, when the report wasn't concluded?
Yeah, I think it was around the provisional report. Remember, the final report came a year after the provisional report because we needed industry to comment on the provisional report before we finalized it. And one of the issues, of course, that got a lot of attention was where we had floated the possibility of breaking up the hospital groups to try and break concentration. Now, that's one thing that got everybody either for or against, but ultimately we couldn't sustain that in the final report. So we didn't proceed.
Okay. This really is most encouraging. Thank you, Dr. Pengu. COVID-19 will no doubt continue to delay progress on the implementation of national health insurance. But even so, whether the bill passes this year or the year after, the only real question left unanswered is how the final version of the NHI bill will differ from what is on the table right now, and how concerns about the governance and structure of NHI will be addressed. A critical question in South Africa's ongoing healthcare reform is whether improving private sector regulation will assist in the transition to an NHI system. In the final report of the Competition Commission's Health Market Inquiry, a compelling argument was made that better private sector regulation will ease the transition to NHI. Well, that is besides private sector reform being a good idea in its own right. Thank you for listening. Until next time.